Now it's a different day. I had to stop the filming because the battery ran out. So I'm going to pick up where I left off, and I'm going to show you where all of this information is leading to an incredible revelation for the last days that has to do with the coming of the Messiah, and the timing of this is really profound because we all know about Jesus telling the parable of the fig tree, and everybody's talking about how this is the fig tree generation, the generation that sees Israel bud and coming back to life and becoming a nation in 1948, that is the sign of the fig tree, and that this generation shall not pass away till all these things are fulfilled. Well, there's something incredible connecting to what I'm telling you about the musical instruments and the cochineal scarlet color and this parable. And this gives a whole new picture to things. The fact that this is being revealed to you right now, right before your eyes. This is the scripture out of Luke 21, starting in verse 29. And Jesus is speaking here, and he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. When you see this, the kingdom of God is near. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So the fig tree generation, so-called, is supposed to be the one that sees Israel blooming, but there's more to the story of the fig tree. Part of it is in my book, and it's a stunning revelation, but let me just tell you something now that's going to blow your mind. Now, I'm going to reveal that the cochineal, the chenille, scarlet color, the insects, they actually are on plants, cactus particularly, and oak trees, that is known as a cochineal fig. Did you hear me? Something I'm about to reveal about King David, the musical instruments, and the wood in the forest, and all of that comes together with this. It's called and known as a Barbary fig. It's called by many names: prickly pear, nopal, tuna, cochineal fig tree. Now remember that lepers were healed in this way, and it's interesting that the oil of the cochineal is antibacterial, antifungal, wound healing, antioxidant powers, and protection and caring for the skin, which I find very fascinating. And we know that the cochineal insect, the chenille, or toleat chenille in Hebrew, is appointed by God as the color scarlet. And as I researched this, because I needed to find out some specific information, I needed to know where the concentration of this dye source came from. I needed to discover where this dye was located during the 16th and 17th century, particularly to get verification of everything that I'm trying to reveal to you. So now, this is being revealed at a time when this chenille, the cochineal insect, is known as the fig tree, and it's being revealed to you right now, and this generation will not pass away till the Messiah comes. And when you see these things, when you're seeing it right now, we won't pass away. The kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Think about that. The barberry fig is a species of cactus that's been cultivated for hundreds of years. And now the chenille insects, they live on the cactus as well as the oak trees. It's native to the Americas, most notably Mexico. It's even on the country's flag, but it's now well established throughout Africa and Asia as well. Like spring breakers, it enjoys warm and sunny locales. This gives a whole new meaning to the fig tree generation, because what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind. So what I needed to discover and find out was in Mexico and South American countries where this cochineal insect was the most prolific, and I needed to know if it went to Europe, and I needed to know if it was there in the 16th and 17th centuries particularly. And I found this information, and I'm going to share this. The title of this from link.springer.com says Mexican Cochineal, Local Technologies and the Rise of Global Trade from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And the cochineal insect is the most prolific in Oaxaca, Mexico, which is down, you know, when you see Mexico come down from the United States, where it curves down, it's right on that little curve right before it hooks up with South America. And it turns out they did import this cochineal dye to Europe, which is very important. And you may be wondering about the name Oaxaca, which is O-A-X-A-C-A, and it is derived from a mimosa, which is from the legume family. It has these long beans that hang on the tree and white flowers. Now let me share some of the history, what I found here. The history of Mexican cochineal over several centuries represents a key chapter in the origins of early modern globalization, both cultural and economic, since this dye was the most expensive in the world from the 16th to the 18th centuries as a result of the consistent demand for luxury textiles dyed with bright crimson, scarlet, or purple colors by monarchs, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and aristocrats in Europe, as well as among the very wealthy almost everywhere. In this chapter, emphasis is placed on a series of elements which relate to the question of how some special commodities, in this case cochineal, produced in the early modern era by peasants in non-European regions, came to play a major role in stimulating global trade and contributed to textile. It goes on to say the special attractions of Mexican cochineal dyes, which arrived in Europe from the early 16th century onwards, were that they fixed a more brilliant and deep red color into woolen or silk cloth, and that they could last. That's important. They could last unblemished for years, and indeed, as was later learned, continue to do so for centuries. A recent and very attractive museum exhibition has demonstrated that Mexican, and to a lesser degree Peruvian cochineal, was sold and applied in luxury textile manufacturing and commercial centers not only in Europe but also throughout the Ottoman Empire, South India, the Spice Islands, China, and Japan from the mid-16th to the mid-19th century. Cochineal had long been cultivated in Tlaxcala and several other regions of New Spain, but by the late 16th century, the bulk of cochineal of the finer quality came to be concentrated in the region of Oaxaca as a result of the strategy adopted by the Spanish administration to establish monopolistic control over the production of grana fina, which they called it, which produced a much higher quality of dye than the more common variety of grana silvestre. This superior type of cochineal was the result of the careful cultivation of the most productive cochineal insects on small plots of nopal, the cactus, the cochineal fig, the thick, juicy leaf of a certain variety of cactus that was tended by peasant families. The considerable population density of pleasant communities in the mountainous territory of Oaxaca was an important precondition for the highly labor-intensive cultivation of the nopal plants on which the cochineal insect thrived. So there you have, not only was this being imported to Europe to the royalty for their garments, but it was also the highest, finest quality that had duration. And that's an important factor. The long-term tendencies indicate that physical production declined from the end of the 18th century, but that there was a notable price increase during the age of the Napoleonic Wars and later during the Wars of Independence in Mexico. The international trade in cochineal was highly complex. Its axis originated in Mexico because the Spanish crown made it policy to foster a virtual production monopoly of grana fina in the region of Oaxaca. But it should also be noted that New Spain, colonial Mexico, was also important as an intermediary for other American dyes, in particular indigo, some produced in Mexico but mostly in neighboring Guatemala, and dyes from Campeche wood. Indigo was in high demand in Europe for the making of blue cloths, while Campeche dyes were used for deep blacks, which were in high demand for religious seasons in both Catholic and Protestant countries, as well as because of fashion, as it can be seen in the contemporary paintings of the Spanish court of Philip II of Spain. The importance of cochineal was reflected in its price, being the most expensive of all dyes. As a result, it often represented a higher proportion of the final cost of fine cloth than other materials essential to their manufacture, including raw or processed fibers, whether wool, silk, or linens. But why was this so? Scarcity of high-quality dyestuffs, of course, played a major role in this, but it is also worthwhile underlining that certain colors had great socioeconomic significance in traditional society for the maintenance of hierarchies. In this regard, it's worthwhile recalling that from the medieval era, one of the colors most prized in the crown, church, and nobility in Europe for their finest fabrics was that of carmine or deep crimson, which is the scarlet from the chenille. It is well known that from the 14th century onwards, the leading luxury textile centers of Europe, particularly Florence and Flanders, that's in Italy, that's where I needed to go, produced crimson cloth in various shade tones by using a variety of red dyestuffs. They used a variety of red dye stuffs, that of carmine or deep crimson. It's well known that from the 14th century onwards, the leading luxury textile centers of Europe, particularly Florence and Flanders, produced crimson cloth in various shades and tones by using a variety of red dye stuffs. According to the historian John Monroe, the medieval scarlets owed their splendor, fame, and high cost to the dyeing process. This was so largely due to the fact that such dye stuffs, particularly derived from insects such as the kermes from the Mediterranean, were quite rare, and because the dyeing processes were complex and required considerable technical skill, the expensive scarlet or crimson fabrics could only be acquired by the wealthiest members of late medieval society. But despite their high price from the early 16th century onwards, the demand for luxury crimson and scarlet cloth continued to climb all over Europe, although most notably in England, Flanders, France, and Italy. Now you'll see why that's important pretty quick here. From the late 1520s, Mexican cochineal had begun to appear on European markets in small quantities, but soon gained wide acceptance as the finest and most durable crimson dye stuff for textiles, particularly woolens and silks. According to one historical study, cochineal possessed from 10 to 12 times the dyeing properties of kermes. It also produced colors far superior in brilliancy and fastness. This dye stuff thus quickly won growing markets in the leading luxury textile manufacturing centers of Europe, including Segovia in Spain, Suffolk in England, Florence, Milan, and Venice in Italy, Rouen and Lyon in France, and various centers in Flanders. Interdisciplinary scientific studies provide concrete evidence on the rapid expansion of European demand for cochineal, the chenille that God directed Moses to use in the building of the tabernacle. A laborious chemical research program on hundreds of samples of medieval and early modern dyed textiles has proved concrete evidence to substantiate the historical assertion. And then it says this: the luxury textile industries of Italy were among the most important of 16th century Europe, and hence were among the major markets for expensive dyes. Substantial quantities of the grana cochineal sent from Veracruz to Seville and Cadiz made their way to the port of Livorno. The Spanish economic historian Felipe Ruiz Martin used the correspondence of contemporary Spanish merchant bankers to trace the exports to Florence, Italy, where a booming luxury textile industry consumed large quantities of dyes. But he also noted that a substantial volume of cochineal was transshipped from Livorno to Venice, where it was used to dye the cheaper textiles, bagnina, sent to Constantinople, as well as for the famous Venetian fez, the religious caps used through the Muslim world. According to both Spanish and Genoese merchants involved in this trade, the crimson dye stuff was always profitable, and in fact its price quadrupled. Examples abound from the late 16th century of attempts to corner the cochineal markets in Europe, including the manipulation of the cochineal trade by groups of leading Spanish and Italian merchant bankers, a number of them closely linked to the finances of the Habsburgs monarchy. The historian Ruiz Martin edited a selection of the abundant correspondence of the Spanish merchant Simon Ruiz with Italian merchants, which includes extremely frequent references to cochineal. The mercantile correspondence of Simon Ruiz is among the richest in that of contemporary Europe, including over 6,000 letters now in deposit at the University of Valladolid. Ruiz, 1965. Such merchant bankers were engaged in the trade circuits, linking Seville, Cadiz, Genoa, Livorno, and Florence Cochineal arrived from Mexico to Seville and Cadiz, and from there was redistributed to the rest of Europe. Most of this cochineal, which went to Italy, went to Livorno, Leghorn, and was transported in the same ships that brought the famous merino wool that was also a commodity which is in demand in the Florentine luxury textile manufacturing sector. The most spectacular speculative operation in the late 16th century related to cochineal was that it carried out by the Florentine merchant banking family known as the Caponi, who, in allegiance with the power of Maluenda, merchant bankers of Burgos, Spain, attempted to corner the entire shipment of cochineal from Mexico arriving at Seville in 1585. They also bought up the bulk of stocks in other European ports in order to reinforce a strategy aimed at gaining a virtual monopoly of the valuable dye stuff. The ambitious plans of the speculators were quite successful and allowed them to push prices upwards, although there was stiff resistance by the artisans in the leading textile centers of Europe. So you may be asking why I'm telling you all of this. You may be asking, what does this godly Toleat Shani scarlet crimson color that God appointed for his tabernacle, and the priest's garments, and the high priest's garments, and the veil before the Ark of the Covenant, and the curtains? You may be wondering, well, I'm going to go back to the musical instruments, and remember I told you that the forest in northern Italy, where Antonio Stradivari got the wood to make the instruments in Cremona, Italy, he went to the northern Alps, the Italian Alps, into the Dolomites in the forest there, and found these resonant trees, and they are the singing forest. They're known as the musical forest. And when King David talked about that in his Psalms, that the trees sing and clap their hands, and he was the major royalty, the producer of musical instruments for the worship of God, and he had this color scarlet in his possession. What am I about to tell you that's going to blow your mind? I think I know exactly what made Antonio Stradivarius violins and cellos and basses the very best in the world to this day, from the 1600s, and I'm revealing this right now. Now, there's a gentleman that just said that he believed that it was the process that the violins were, the wood was soaked in, the treatment that the wood received that created this special sound. But God is showing me that it has to do with Stradivarius using a very special varnish. And let me reveal this huge secret in connection of why Stradivarius violins sound better than any other in the world to this day. I just find this so exciting, because when you think about that King David mentioned the tree singing, and he must have known that there was resonant wood that he made his musical instruments out of, then what else did he do to his instruments? Because he was royalty, he was a monarch, and That was the finest dye stuffs of the monarchies. The violin, viola, and cello were first made in the early 16th century in Italy. That's why I had to get to Italy with it. The earliest evidence for their existence is in paintings by Gaudenzio Ferrari from the 1530s. Ferrari's instruments had only 3 strings. Bowed stringed instruments have been handmade since the 16th century in Cremona, Italy, which is also the hometown of Antonio Stradivari, perhaps the greatest violin maker in history. And why is that secret coming out now? And why is it connected to the fig tree? Now think about this. Antonio Stradivari, Latin Stradivarius, born approximately 1644 in Cremona, the Duchy of Milan. So where did the dye stuffs go from Oaxaca, Mexico? One of the places was Milan. And it was the finest that there was. And it had long-lasting duration, kind of like the Stradivarius instruments. Stradivari died December 18th, 1737, Cremona, Italian violin maker who brought the craft of violin making to its highest pitch of perfection. For centuries, they've been trying to figure out what made his violins stand out, have endurance for all of this time, even to this day, being some of the best sounding instruments in the world. And this has been a secret that they haven't been able to figure out. But Stradivari was still a pupil of Niccolò Amati in 1666 when he began to place his own label on violins of his making. These at first followed the smaller of Amati's models, solidly constructed with a thick yellow varnish. In 1684, Stradivari began to produce larger models using a deeper colored varnish and experimenting with minute details in the form of the instrument. His long models, dating from the 1690, represent a complete innovation in the proportions of the instrument from 1700. After returning for a few years to an earlier style, he again broadened and otherwise improved his model. He also made some fine cellos and violas. The Stradivari method of violin making created a standard for subsequent times. He devised the modern form of the violin bridge and set the proportions of the modern violin with its shallower body that yields a more powerful and penetrating tone than earlier violins. It was long thought that the secret of Stradivari's acoustically perfect violins lay in their varnish, the formula of which, though much debated, has never been discovered. Until now, because I'm going to tell you. However, modern research has isolated certain factors that influence the beauty of a violin's tone. Among these are the thickness and hence the vibrational properties of its wooden top and back plates. That's because they're the resonant trees from the singing forest. The condition of the microscopic pores within the wood of the violin, and lastly, the formula of the varnish. Stradivari's success probably came from expertly optimizing all these and other factors within his designs. The golden age of violin production in Cremona, a duchy of Milan, was created by the Amati family and continued by the Stradivari and Guarneri families and lasted from the mid-16th century to the mid-18th century, during which period 10,000 to 20,000 outstanding instruments were produced. So you have right at the age when Oaxaca was in vast production producing the cochineal scarlet color crimson and sending it over to Milan, Italy, and Florence, Italy, and Europe, right at the time when the violin making started really taking off. And then after Stradivari died, the red dye started dying off, so to speak, and wasn't used as much anymore in the 18th century. Now they have detected two other red pigments in Stradivari's varnish, red iron oxides and a lake pigment, made of an anthraquinone dye, probably cochineal. Did you hear that? On an alumina strata. Bertrand indicates that a very broad array of techniques was an absolute necessity to cope with the analytical challenge of studying such complex micro samples. Stradivari therefore used materials that were easily obtained and broadly used in his time. The use of multiple red pigments allowed him to give a variety of tints to his instruments, which are still highly prized for their beautiful appearance. In other words, they had duration. They had a long-lasting duration, just like the cochineal dye. Stradivari thus did not use any unusual or secret ingredients. He was simply a true master of his craft. Now remember, the cochineal from Oaxaca was the most excellent and enduring dye of them all. Now keep in mind that Stradivari was making instruments for the wealthy and powerful and the royal families that were literally the color of money, it's said. From the Strad.com, it says, "We live with the myth and lore of the beautiful finishes of the classical Cremonese instruments, but what we now call the Stradivari varnish has come to stand above everything else. Although it's similar to the finishes of his predecessors and contemporaries, in particular those of the Amati and Brescian traditions from the 1680s onwards, something singular identified Stradivari's work. Human beings see the color red and its variations better than any other mammal. The significance of red in our lives goes back to the Neanderthals, that's a matter of opinion, who buried their dead in red ochre. From human culture as a sign, some version of power to this color. In ancient China, it was the color of health and prosperity. In the Arab world, it signified divine favor and vitality. The Roman Empire was ruled by a class whose name, Cochineal, literally meant those who wear red. It is the color of kings and queens, cardinals and demons. Now, was King David a king? And did he build musical instruments? And did he have access to cochineal for the soon building of the temple of his son Solomon? He prepared everything for it. The varnish on Stradivari's earliest instrument closely resembles that of his mentor, Niccolo Amati. But by the mid-1680s, his varnish had become strikingly more red and was acquiring those traits that would set his work over and above that of his considerably talented contemporaries. Cochineal varnish became the signature appearance for instruments made in the Stradivari workshop. Stradivari was making instruments for the wealthy and powerful that were literally the color of money, and he was the only maker to have this incredible varnish. Well, you know what? I think this is a secret for the last days. I think that this is the color that God chose for the tabernacle and for everything that was in it. And it had the Cochineal, the Chenille, and Stradivari got this dye, probably from the finest from Oaxaca, sent to Milan, and used it on his varnish, and he was the only one. And his violins are the ones that are the finest to this day because they endured for all these hundreds of years. I think that the cochineal insect being used on the Stradivarius instruments is the secret, the special God-given color for the tabernacle of God was used only on the Stradivari instruments. He's the only one that put it in his varnish. That is the secret revealed. And the fact that I discovered that cochineal is the fig tree that they refer to it, even though it's on a cactus and it's also on oak trees. But the finest in the world came from Oaxaca, Mexico. And I've been able to research this, and God revealed this for such a time as this. Now, I do believe that since King David was the musical instrument maker and designed the instruments for the first temple of Solomon, and I believe that he had the color cochineal, and I believe that he knew about the resonant wood of the trees singing because he wrote about it in his Psalms. I believe that he had the cochineal color, and I believe that he may have used that on his musical instruments as well. And somehow Stradivari got the idea to use it for the instruments for the royalty. I think this is a divine revelation for the last days. I am totally stunned by it. And I have to tell you that something I said before about befriending the Harari harp makers, and I was friends with her for about 5 years, but they did not accept the Messiah. And I just found out that all of their harps that they built for the last 40 years in their gallery, in their workshop, they have burned completely down to ash. And their workshop is completely destroyed. Well, why is this being revealed now? Because maybe the future of those instruments has got to have this special resonant wood, and it's got to have this varnish to honor God, the God of Israel, and to have the royal color of scarlet crimson Chenille as the varnish on the musical instruments of God. And then God will be pleased and happy. So this just blows my mind. And we are the fig tree generation, and this is being revealed about this color on the musical instruments, and possibly King David putting them on his instruments, and being revealed right now in the fig tree generation. If this is not stunning, I don't know what is. So the only harps that are left are the ones that Shoshana Harari has herself, and I think there's about 3 of them that they donated to the Temple Institute. And those are the only ones they have. Everything in their gallery burned to ash, and it's really shocking. This came to me when I was watching the violin makers that are there today in Cremona, Italy, and they were showing them sanding and cutting wood and all of this stuff, and they were talking a little bit about finishing them and everything, and then they showed pictures of things that were on the wall, and they just showed bottles and jars of things, and I happened to see the word cochineal, and I knew that it was the Toliat. Now, ironically, at the same time when God is showing this to me, this article popped up yesterday from Texas A&M University, where this professor has been trying to figure out for years the secret of the Stradivari violins sound. It's from Texas A&M Today, and he's a retired professor that's been trying to figure out the secret, but he said that the varnish recipes were not secret because the varnish itself is not a critical determinant of tone quality. In contrast, the process of how the fresh spruce planks were treated and processed with a variety of water-based chemical treatments is critical for the sound of the finished violin. Such knowledge was needed to gain a competitive advantage over other instrument makers, he said. And this guy's name is Stradivari, added that the team found the chemicals used were found all over and inside the wood, not just its surface, and this directly affected the sound quality of the instruments. Antonio Stradivari, 1644 to 1737, made about 1,200 violins in his lifetime and sold them only to the very rich, including the royalty. Today there are about 600 Stradivari violins remaining. So I really believe, and he believes that it's not the varnish because that wasn't a secret. He believes it's the way the wood was treated. But I believe that God consecrated this specific Cochineal Toliat Shani color for the tabernacle of God himself. Now, I believe that this is the secret. The Cochineal is the secret. And just thinking about that the instruments have this endurance, and the Cochineal was known to have a long-lasting, brilliant fastness that no other die had at the time. And since that's the only component that set Stradivari's varnish apart from others, to me that reveals that it is the Toliat Shani, the very crimson worm that King David prophesied about as the Messiah, which is of course his descendant, Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach of Nazareth. It's funny too that there is a painting, an image of King David that's shown crowned, wearing a bright red cloak lined with royal ermine. He is seated cross-legged in a golden chair playing the harp. Now I know that this is somebody's imagination, but think of the fact that the extent that the Levites and King David went to consecrate and purify everything, and they would have been actually wearing the scarlet Toliat Shani, crimson scarlet color. David had it on his ephod, and the high priest's garments had them, and even the Levites, and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they took the Ark of the Covenant to set it from the tent of Obed-Edom to the new temple that his son Solomon built. So they accompanied the Ark of the Covenant always with musical instruments of the temple. So I believe that this was a consecration method of consecrating the musical instruments. And this treatment of the wood would have been something that would have consecrated King David's musical instruments. And I believe this is being revealed right now, and it has to do with the fig tree. I mean, I'm just blown away. It's said, too, that the period around the time of David was one of the most musically rich periods in biblical times. According to historical documents, at the time of David, there were 36 different types of musical instruments, only half of which were mentioned in the Bible. So, why wouldn't King David have consecrated the instruments with the color of scarlet? And perhaps that knowledge was handed down. I don't know, but during the centuries, it's really a stunning, stunning divine revelation for the last days. Now let me say before I get to the scriptures that the kinnor, the ancient Hebrew lyre, the musical instrument of King David, according to the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, 1st century AD, it resembled the Greek kithara. And from that came the guitar. And kinnor was translated as kithara in both the Greek Old Testament and the Latin Bible. Medieval writers often mistakenly called it a harp. The kinnor had from 3 to 12 gut strings in late antiquity, usually 10. It was played with a plectrum when accompanying singing or dancing, but was apparently plucked with the fingers when used as a solo instrument. And of course, the scriptures tell us that David played with his hand, so he was playing a solo instrument. Let's read in 1 Chronicles 15. And it came to pass when God helped the Levites that bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that they offered 7 bullocks and 7 rams. And David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, and all the Levites that bear the ark, and the singers, and Chinaniah, the master of the song, with the singers. David also had upon him an ephod of linen. Thus all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting, and with the sound of the cornet, and with trumpets, and with cymbals, making noise with psalteries and harps. Now I believe this was later, 2 Chronicles 29. And he set the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and with psalteries and the harps, according to the commandment of David, and of Gad the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet. For so was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. And the Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. And Hezekiah commanded to offer the burnt offering upon the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord began, also with the trumpets, and with the instruments ordained by David, king of Israel. And all the congregation worshipped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded, and all of this continued until the burnt offering was finished. So I think the instruments of today that have been made have not been consecrated and made in this way. And I believe that they were wearing the Cochineal scarlet color on their outfits, and they had the curtain for the Ark of the Covenant and everything, so they played these instruments before the Ark. So why wouldn't they consecrate the instruments that King David made with that color? And I believe that they did. And I believe that probably somewhere in King David's tomb, perhaps he was buried with an existing harp that still endures to this day. And someday it's going to be discovered. 2 Chronicles 7:6. And the priests stood according to their offices, and the Levites also with instruments of music of the Lord, which David the king had made, to give thanks unto the Lord. And this would have been consecrated to the Lord. For his mercy endureth forever, with the praises of David by their hand, and the priests sounded trumpets over against them, and all Israel stood. And then it says that there were those that tried to copy King David's instruments. It says in Amos 6, verse 5, that thrum on the psaltery, that devise for themselves instruments of music like David. They were trying to imitate him. So maybe with this discovery, maybe the harps are supposed to be made differently now, with this special consecration of the Toleat Shani varnish. and then all good things will come. King David prepared all of these things, and it says in 2 Chronicles 1:4, "But the ark of God had David brought up from Kiriath Jearim to the place that David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem." If he prepared that, he's going to prepare his musical instruments to be consecrated for God, but also to be the finest for the finest of the fine and the most royal king of all the earth and heavens, God himself. And I believe this is being revealed because the Messiah is nigh at hand, because behold, the fig tree and all the trees. So herein I am revealing that this is the secret of Antonio Stradivari's violins and other musical instruments.